You are listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast. Hello! Where are you right now? I am working in Central Oregon. We have a partnership with Redmond Public Schools, and we are working, we're doing a cohort model where they're actually trying to figure out how to better meet the needs of their students, particularly as it relates to what they're focusing on this year, is creating a more belonging space, a place where people feel like they belong. Very apropos as it relates to who we're going to talk about today. I was thinking the same thing. As you were just describing where you are, what you're doing, I'm thinking, this is Dr. Kurt Schneider. And it really does speak to that this is an issue nationwide. The challenge of leading equity work and managing adults and managing adult responses, emotional responses to the work. He had a quote I thought that was interesting in there. It isn't when you sometimes think of quotes in terms of a profound sort of soundbite, as much as it really, to me, transmitted what he's been thinking and feeling. It says, I think also, and I was in a conversation this morning managing the adult emotional response to the work, and it's really exhausting, and it's the job. So it's a major part of the job. So I'm not skirting that. I'm just saying it's a lot. And I thought, oh my God, totally. It's a lot. That is literally the last quote, word for word, what I wrote down. That's the last thing I noted. I actually connected it to something you said in the podcast, where you said it all goes back to those mental models. So equity work is really slow because our models are fixed. And if I connect that line to the adult's emotional response to the work is really exhausting. Exactly. Yeah, we adults are slow. We're slow. Oh my goodness, are we slow? I heard a quote once about child behavior, particularly when you're working on a behavior plan for a child and you're trying to create those replacement behaviors and think about the function of one's behavior and what they're trying to get to or get away from. And I heard something from, I think it was a positive behavior intervention support person at the University of Missouri. And they said, for every year old a child is, that's how many months it will take to get to the desired result. And I went, oh, whoa. Child is 10, it will take a full year. Child is 20, it will take 2 years. So then I'm thinking, adult is 40, it's going to take forever. So I love this. Exactly. And to your point of fixed models, and this came up more than once around fear. Whatever's the quote about fear? Oh, here it is. We create this program and it's got a certain location connotation to it, a certain type of staff member that can only know how to work with a certain kind of learners. And what I wrote was that person that's the special ed teacher. They have so many special skills. I don't know how to do that. That's fear. People are afraid of difference, very fearful of difference. And then it had me leaning into all of the ways in which people can or can't do something in their head. They're closed off to it. And I told you that this would be a very personal podcast for me, as my middle son has a cognitive disability called Phelan-McDermid. It has a whole bunch of symptoms and a whole bunch of things that go with it, a very long story. But one of the things symptoms that shows up that I think is actually rooted in fear for folks is that he is, and will not be, can't use the bathroom by himself. He will never know how to toilet himself. So your job as the parent, my job, and then the job of the teacher is to be able to take him to the toilet and to deal with his diaper. And he is 13 years old now. That's only going to get bigger. And I think people are afraid of poop. I think they're really afraid of poop. And I think it's amazing because we will pay plumbers so that we don't actually have to see, deal with, talk about. I think it's fascinating. Why? What is it? Why? I do hope that you're going to let me keep this in our conversation for today. I think there'd be great value in allowing me to keep it in because I do think we have an incredible leader in this episode who's very thoughtful about everything from the name of the district, how they shifted the name, as opposed to having a special district for children with special needs. He's named the district TrueNorth, which I think is so important because the whole piece around We're not going to be identified as a special school district with special needs because really, our children are exceptional and they ought to be known for that they are absolutely loved and that they belong here. He talks about the power of relationship and understanding individual needs and your willingness to talk about the individual needs of your child. And yes, in a traditional setting, for some reason, and potentially it's because it is just not something adults had the experience of doing and choose to instead reject as opposed to lean in and embrace. And this district, it seemed like, whoa, they are all in on children and their needs. And whatever their needs are. Yes. Yeah. And he talked about, I think the quote was that to be grouped. So he's talking about students being grouped by their label, autism, special education, that can limit the educational experiences and reinforce the separation from peers and be seen as the other. His quote was, and to be grouped and to have some sort of predefined program in terms of how it functions and who's interacting and the curriculum that's used really marginalizes and provides a very narrow educational experience. I really thought that was so special, especially as it relates, like that resonated for me as a parent of a kid who has special needs. We had to go get an autism diagnosis, even though that's not what it is necessarily, depending on what you mean by autism. But the reason why we got it was the school system, he got more support if he went into school with an autism diagnosis. And by support, funding and power on our end to be able to say, here's what we want him to have. People who care for Pablo and will do what they can to care for Pablo. Jesus is doing a ton to care for him. What is happening is, and you've said it earlier, which I actually have a good question. I have a question for you about this. The system has rules and policies that create barriers for parents to get what they need for kids. And somewhere along the line, those rules and policies made sense to someone. I'm going to answer that question, and I'm going to be incredibly vulnerable because I have been the bearer of that news to families in my office as a superintendent. And let's talk about it in a minute, though. Let's hear the conversation with Dr. Kurt Schneider, superintendent of TrueNorth.
Yes, let's do that. Imperfect leaders, are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question, because I know you are. Empath Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with Empath Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. Empath Speech, EMPAT speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools.
Today on An Imperfect Leader, my guest is Dr. Kurt Schneider, the superintendent of TrueNorth Educational Cooperative 804 in Highland Park, Illinois. And under his direction, the Educational Cooperative works in partnership with 18 local school districts. And there are so many things to note about Kurt, who is elected to the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development's Leadership Council, so ASCD. And he's been recognized by them. He's also served as a part-time adjunct professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, teaching doctorate courses in the Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis Department. He's partnered with the university faculty to establish a National Integrated Comprehensive Systems Equity Institute, and he's co-authored a book chapter on bilingual students within integrated comprehensive services. And I'm really interested in that. My own doctorate is in second language acquisition, and I've always been interested in looking at acquisition, sometimes with delays, whether or not we're talking about a child who's got a disability or whether it's the normal course of learning a second language. But let me tell you a little bit more about Kurt. He's a former special education teacher. He served as a teacher or volunteer executive in Alexandria, Egypt. Kurt, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for including me.
Oh, I'm so happy that you're here. And I hope it's okay if I just jump right in on a topic that really interests me tremendously, and that's district and school transformation. So you were
interviewed for a piece on this topic. What captured my attention was inclusive practices. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. But transformational change, especially in the area of special education, is something that leaders across the country, they want to lead. It's what parents of exceptional learners are craving, but it's often, it seems out of reach. And I think it's because it's approached as an initiative and not a cultural change. And those are your words. As I was reading, you were saying, look, it can't be an initiative. It's really got to be about cultural change. So I wonder, would you tell us maybe a little bit about what you mean by that?
I've been blessed to have had both academic and EC12 professionals mentor me throughout my career. And from a very beginning, early point in my career development and my studies, really looking at the learning outcomes of all student groups was a key ingredient to my preparation. All too often, we end up talking about kids in isolation of others. We'll talk about students with disabilities or students who speak more than one language or students from various economic backgrounds. And it's been my training and my learning to really understand that we got to look at all different forms of difference and the strategies and tools that work really well, that cut across all student groups. And how do we make sure everybody gets access to the good stuff? And it's clear that meaning practices are at play, but they may not be giving as much access to the good stuff. Part of my interest in becoming a superintendent was to help shift school systems from, in many cases for certain learners, having more reactive responses to student learning outcomes and trying to shift it so that everybody gets proactive services and supports in a way that doesn't marginalize or separate them from the whole. And it's very clear that transformational change requires leaders to be knowledgeable and educated across all different forms of difference and the teaching practices associated that help everyone. And that's why I spent my time, both academically and in terms of my current position, really working with people who have strong instructional leadership lenses, because that's what it takes to do this.
So when you talk about practices that will serve all children and not just some, I guess the some is an initiative and the whole change is what you're talking about. I'm curious about what an example might be. I have some in my head and I'm trying to figure out, is that an initiative or is that cultural change? What comes to mind for you when you think about practices that have shifted the way that you're able to lead and the children are able to learn?
Yeah, in life and particularly in schools, we naturally want to group what we perceive as like-minded people or people who look similar or have similar characteristics together. In doing that, we lose sight of the fact that they may be aligned in one characteristic, but be very different in other forms. We fool ourselves to think that we group these kids and staff in a way that is helpful to long term, that permanently tracks them and separates them from the whole. An example would be, we are very loose with the term program. We group kids based on an IQ measure or some sort of test score into some sort of group, and they become part of that cohort permanently. That becomes problematic. For using as an example, students with disabilities, we create this program and it's got a certain location connotation to it and a certain type of staff member that can only know how to work with a certain kind of learners. Their school experience becomes narrow. The staff who serve them are also segregated and self-contained as well.
Gotcha. So for example, we'd say in some school districts, oh, your child has been diagnosed and has autism. Right. And so we have a great autism teacher and she is at this building. And so all children with autism will go to that building and have their courses there.
We assume that all students with autism are the same. When you know one student with autism, we only have one student with autism, just like everyone else.
Right.
To be grouped and to have some sort of like predefined program in terms of how it functions and who's interacting and the curriculum that is used really marginalizes and provides a very narrow educational experience that's based on this quote unquote autism characteristic, when they may have similar interests as everyone else in the school. Their school experience isn't built on that and their passions. It's built on whatever we've used to determine that they have this quote unquote label of autism.
Gotcha. So when we talk about school transformation, we talk about starting with a compelling purpose, a shared image of what we want to achieve together. And we branch out to what are kids curious about and how do we leverage their curiosity and creativity? That gets limited if we're saying, first, we're going to start with this kid diagnosis and move them to a certain program because that's what they need. I'm curious about this because I imagine there are a lot of leaders who would like to change the way it looks in their district, not sure where to start. I know that you have described change as a slow process. I wonder if you could give others permission to take the time that's needed to make that meaningful change. My question is about what kind of advice you might offer those who are interested in shifting, but aren't really sure where to start yet.
Everyone's entry point is different. So my advice would be, whatever that is, it's going to be uniquely different. I'm working with a school district out in North Carolina. Their entry point is based upon a particular piece of legislation. In my previous role, I was in the western suburbs of Chicago, and there was a lot of conversation on how to continue to make growth for students who are really advanced. So your entry point might be with that particular group. So I think it depends on where you are and what the issue currently is. There's a set of beliefs that sometimes need to get challenged as a leader when you're challenging practices associated with certain groups that might have been in place for a long time. It's important to know you might experience different emotional responses to what you're trying to do. So there's going to be some people who are going to be like, oh my God, finally, yes, I have somebody in here who's going to be able to move this, and they're excited. You might have another group of people who are going to be more about, tell me more. What is he trying to do? And they're going to be asking some questions. And then you might have another small group of people that might not be thrilled about it at all and be very antagonistic. That is part of equity work. And so when you're looking at your system and strengthening the lens of equity across the board, what you're ultimately doing that you have to be prepared for is to know that you're shifting the power dynamics of who sits at the table. Using students of color, for example, if they may not have access to upper level courses, for example, and you're trying to work to ensure that they are, that's going to change the conversation about who's sitting at that table. Same thing with a student who might have autism. You might be trying to give them different experiences. And so that means they might be in different courses that they may not have historically been enrolled in. And so that's going to change who sits at the table. And so that is inherent in the work. And if you have the right support in the right places, you are going to be able to move the work forward. To do that, you have to have good relationships across various groups of people, and then you can move the work. And that's would be my advice, is to really spend time hearing individual people's stories, forming positive relationships with people, knowing what your true intentions are and what you're trying to accomplish. We get bogged down in education ease. So my advice would be, don't get into all this vocabulary. When I'm talking with staff or parents or community members, I really keep it pretty simple that everybody wants to go to school where their brothers and sisters get to go. Everybody wants to have a course schedule that matches their interests and their passions. Everybody wants to be able to have lunch and sit with somebody that they want to be with. Everybody wants to have someone to do something with on a Friday night. Everybody wants to live, work, and play in a community that embraces them. And so when you keep it in those terms, I haven't met a mom or a dad that says, I disagree with. And that's across students with disabilities or families of color, or,
I was actually thinking this from this continuum of exceptional children, because it is you think of this continuum of children with disabilities and gifted children, and it actually wraps around because you have double exceptional, right? Children with disabilities who are also gifted.
Yeah.
And I was trying to think of it from, how do you also have those conversations when you want to, the system will work aggressively to work its way back to status quo. It likes status quo. It's comfortable there. Those who have benefited from it enjoy it. Those who have not benefited from it are always interested in agitating for the change, but the system works its way back often. And so I love your advice in terms of getting a beat on the system, knowing the system's history, having deep conversations, thinking about where people are going to support, where people are going to ask for more information, and where people are going to aggressively work against what you're trying to do. Much of my interest was in terms of entering this conversation with you in terms of your expertise around exceptional children with disabilities. But then I started to flip it in the sense of, in my mind, what about our interest in not having a group of just gifted kids going to this gifted class together? Rather, how do we all benefit from what we would say is enriching and enriched curriculum? So It was on my mind.
Well, expanding upon a couple of the points you just made, it's funny because when I'm talking with parents, the language we use really will resonate with people. And a conversation I just had with some families, they're like, I've got this particular mom has more than one child, and I'm a child of typical learner too. Don't call me, I'm the special ed parent or I'm the exceptional parent. I'm just a parent. I have different kids. They have different needs. I try to figure out how to meet their needs. That's it.
I had a guest recently who said for him, the definition of equity is around our children getting what they need. And his argument was about those who would challenge words around equity and inclusion and diversity. And when it came to the term equity, he's going, I'm not sure where the issue is. Our children getting what they need. That's our responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting how now more than ever in the climate in which we're trying to lead this work, it's even more important to really think carefully about how we position the work, language we use, the relationships that we have. And you can still certainly do the work, but I think there's a level of reflection and carefulness more than ever.
It's always been a highly political position, and even more so.
Even more so now.
If you're just joining us, my guest today is Dr. Kurt Schneider, superintendent of the TrueNorth School District. I wrote a book recently, and then in the podcast and in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's this dimension called collective aspiration. It's really the heart of an organization's work, and it speaks to Peter Senge's question of what do we want to create together? And inside that dimension is a term I mentioned earlier, compelling purpose. A friend and a colleague of mine, Zach Taylor, he works in Santa Fe and he does this so well. It speaks to an article you wrote, Rebranding Your School. Here's how to get staff on board. I loved it. And I'll put a link to it in the show notes as well. But essentially, you're helping leaders communicate their compelling purpose. And in everything I've read about you, it is clear that systemic transformation for all learners, as you have mentioned, right? It's grounded in equity. It's grounded in social justice. It has been and continues to be your career focus. I saw that you dropped the term special education from your school district's name. You removed the label that was well-intentioned but might have the potential to marginalize students and their families.
Right.
It almost speaks to why a parent would say, I have children with different needs. What are the ways that you build support for your compelling purpose and for your brand, both internally and externally? I'm really curious about that whole process.
Yeah, when the school organization was adopting our first strategic plan that we hadn't, in the organization's history, I had entered the school district and there hadn't been a plan in well over maybe 10 years. So I refer to that as our first strategic plan because now we're in our second. So in that first strategic plan, the mission and the vision, revisiting those statements was a big part of our work. And in doing that, some of the actions and objectives that were identified was ultimately taking a look at the name of the organization. Because if you truly are looking forward and trying to help everyone identify their own individual direction guided by these values and principles, the current name that was well-meaning in 1960 when the organization was first established no longer was going to be the right fit moving forward because it was in direct conflict with an inclusive mission and vision. And language matters, and how people are identified matters. And it was the collective stakeholders, parents, staff, school board members, community members that had come together. Part of the work was we need to figure out how to take this on. But when you really had conversations with the end users, students with disabilities and their families, they were the group that was most impactful. They said that this name, they understood the history, the well-meaningness of it, but they felt that it separated them and was actually having a negative impact. Parents were feeling as though down the hall for a conference, they'd go to the quote unquote special ed conference and all the other parents were going down the other hallway and they wanted to go down the other hallway. So why can't we just go to a parent-teacher conference? Why are we separated? That's because you're part of this school district with this sort of special name and label to it. And so the students, when we asked them, they were very clear with the fact that if you're going to do anything to help us improve our lives, we agree that language matters and nobody raises their hand and wants to have a name associated with something that's going to make them feel different from everyone else. But they said, if you're going to change it, then mean it. Don't just do it for politicalness or perception. Then the practices that are associated with it need to change too, because we know we're separated and we know why we're here. And it's not right. And between the parents and the students gave us the push to ultimately change the name. And administrators, ironically, who want to believe they're pretty innovative and thoughtful and progressive, actually became the most conservative in the conversation. Because of the potential pushback, it was the parents and the students who in the end had the most courage to change the name. So TrueNorth, we worked with a branding consultant. And just to quickly tell the listeners, TrueNorth is true to the values of diversity, equity, and inclusive practices. Geographically, we sit in the northern suburbs of Chicago, and they wanted to hang on to that identity of the North. So when we put True and North together, we made it one word intentionally. It's True North, so, because everyone's final destination in life should be driven by these values, but it's going to be different for everyone. We're not trying to get everyone to the same destination or job. It should be in any job that they want, to live wherever they want, to have housing wherever they want. And it's not going to be the same for everyone. True North is about individuality guided by these values. And Educational Cooperative is we're a collection of 18 school districts. And the practices associated with raising learning outcomes for all these groups is what we're doing. And it's not just about one group called students with disabilities, because good teaching is good teaching and it cuts across everyone. So why are we hanging on to that label? So we pulled that out purposefully and intentionally so that the future work of the organization could be about practices of good quality instruction and learning that are relatable to anybody. And then we also finally said that our mission tagline was going to be every learner, every day, where you hear that everybody knows that and in our system. And it's not every learner with a disability or every learner who's of color it is literally every learner. And the adults, the school board, the staff, community members, the mayor, we're all learners, and we're there all every day. And so that's the whole brand of the organization.
It's interesting because every learner every day becomes this moral focus. It becomes your true north, right? This sort of north. We look to the North Star for guidance. Unless you're in the Southern Hemisphere, then you don't do that.
Yeah. And our little symbol, we purposefully have a little compass, but it's tilted off to the side because everyone said, how come the compass isn't pointing north? And it's because it might not be.
I like that better than the image of a child trying to reach for the stars, which they can't possibly ever actually do. So it just seems like your goals are always perpetually out of reach. So I much prefer a compass and using it for direction as opposed to some sort of thing that you're trying to actually grab.
Yeah. So. It took 2 years, and in a school geographical area where a lot of people have a lot of opinions, it took 2 years and I think 4 or 5 rounds of names to try to get what we had. But once we felt like our instinct was like, this might be it, ultimately it was the students and the parents that pushed it through.
I love it. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
It was interesting when I first saw that, when you used that. I had a moment of reflection. I thought, that's interesting. I think we're all nervous to share our areas where something might not have gone well or whatever because of in the role you're an N of one. And it's easy, I think, to lead with fear. So we don't want to always be as honest if something doesn't go well, or we don't want others to know, because I think the political pressure of the position doesn't always lend itself to being authentic with that. And yet we all are. We are all imperfect. Every day is a new assignment, if you will. And we may make a right decision at the right time, or in the end, that may not have gone well. So I actually really liked it and found it was interesting because I've not really necessarily heard that. And it did cause me to pause because really it makes a lot of sense. We all are actually imperfect leaders. What we're trying to do is make the next best decision. That's what we're trying to do.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being. And I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and After some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest is Dr. Kurt Schneider, Superintendent of TrueNorth Educational Cooperative 804 in Highland Park, Illinois. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. So, Kurt, what happened?
I knew when I accepted this position, it was going to be doing work that I was passionate about, but on a much larger scale. The listeners need to understand that Illinois would be a very segregated state in many ways. And for certain learners, there are practices and data that are some of the lowest performing in the country and some of the weakest practices. For example, we're a state that funds the most self-contained separate institutions for people with disabilities. That policy and practice then has a lot of funding attached to it. And the K-12 systems then very much prepare and have prepared learners for day programs and self-contained lives after high school. So you can see a track that starts at a very early age, that flows through the school systems here, and ultimately flows into the services and quote unquote programs, life after high school, that are also self-contained. And so it became very apparent to me that this needs to be disrupted. And it will not just disrupted for students with disabilities. You can see practices, the same would be true for other student groups who might not be in the majority. And so that if you're going to have an organization that's an educational cooperative, some states may not have a system that we currently have. It should be to work in partnership with school districts to help make these shifts so that not only am I working on shifting and transforming the original intention of what an educational cooperative is, but at the same time also working with 18 school districts to help them influence and change theirs too. So there's two things that are going on there. And so in doing that, I knew that a lot of what I knew would be a gap between what I knew and had spent my career learning and studying and putting into practice, because I'm not from here, and what was currently happening boots on the ground. And so I knew we needed a strategic plan, and I knew that we needed to educate. And so my intention was to spend a year learning and having conversations of data and research and looking at best practice before you were engaging 1,000+ people in a strategic planning process, that we would have some level of awareness to really what could be and what should be and what might not be the current reality boots on the ground. I spent time, for example, within the first couple of weeks of taking my position, doing an administrative retreat and sharing research and practice, who I am, what I've done, what's best for kids in learning, doing similar things with our school board in every school board meeting, having discussions about research and articles. And by and large, it was well received. So I have difficulty answering the question, because what happened, I don't know if I could have maybe done it differently, but what happened is I made an assumption that everyone is learning and talking and getting up to speed to go into strategic planning. And depending on who the person was on the receiving end, may or may not have been in any of these conversations. Some people took the information as if you were already implementing and that you were moving forward on all these things, when in fact, all we were doing was having various study groups to engage in conversation and to talk and figure out, like, how do we want to put this together? That year-long learning, which then led into strategic planning, which was another year, was about a 2-year effort. That road probably could have been shorter, because that it created anxiety that wasn't intended. And politically, I think I didn't necessarily really get out as much to form relationships and meet with different people because I was instantly thrown into all these discussions about, oh my God, you're moving into doing this. And like, it was already like a done deal when it was just sharing and studying. So I was caught in a situation where I'm transitioning in, I'm trying to meet people. The same time they're asking, what's your vision? What's your philosophy? And you're telling them, and it's what you were hired to do. And at the same time, people are making an assumption that you're putting all of, in the purest sense, everything that you're reading and talking about into practice yesterday. It created a tension. I still, 10 years later, almost 10 years later, there's still certain relationships may not be as strong as I would have hoped because of how people may have interpreted some of those initial beginning steps.
That's so fascinating because so often when we talk to leaders and we say, tell me about something that happened, and they'll say, I really wanted to hit the ground running. And so I convened some folks, I put together some listening sessions and really felt like I needed to get going. And so I put together this strategic plan, got the board to approve it, and then it blew up in my face. And when I say it could overlook, they'll say, I fell victim to the impulse to make a quick decision. And so it's so fascinating to me, right? Because you're the opposite, which is to say, look, I am coming into this role. Maybe one thing that got overlooked is that, as you noted, this was the first strategic plan because previous administrations had not had one. So it was the first one in 10 years. So you called it the first, and now you're in your second. And so in that first strategic plan, perhaps no one had the experience of going through this process of really listening. And so you're convening different groups because you've got to make decisions with the people most impacted. Right. And so you're doing that, talking to children, talking to parents, talking to teachers, talking to community members, talking to your board, and really trying to get a sense. They're all asking you questions. So you're answering honestly because you want them to have clarity about your values. Oh. And their takeaway was, I guess we're doing this. And then it sounds like what got overlooked was perhaps they didn't fully understand what the intent was. And then because you were really diligent in taking the time, they began to get anxious and frustrated, and they thought there were false starts when you hadn't even started yet.
Yeah. And part of what I was trying to do that I thought I was doing well was I was very clear with the school board that was hiring me, what I stood for, my work of the past, and was very honest with what I thought this mission of the system could be. And that was debated when you're hiring candidates and all that kind of stuff. And I was enthusiastically, unanimously approved and felt as though, and in conversations with board members, people were like, oh, this is refreshing. This is exactly what we need. And the read from most superintendents was very much similar. And the data that was coming into me was like, okay, I'm not off track. And then
of course you had 18 different schools. So that really is going to take time to bring people together around a shared image. Yeah. What we mean by dismantling a historic practice of isolating children.
Correct. Exactly.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, but I think as I reflect on all of this, it is equity work. Because even with best intentions of going slow and preparing and reading and studying and looking at data and all those kinds of things, no leader can anticipate every receiver's response. And you still have to be really strong with your core of what is best for kids. I haven't met a mom and a dad that have said that what we're trying to do to really make sure that everyone is meaningfully valued in their community is wrong.
So you made mention of it's been 10 years and there are still some relationships where you felt that you wish they were stronger. What did you learn about relationships?
What I learned is that they're ongoing and you're constantly trying to cultivate. And I spend a lot of time, for example, meeting with each school board member. I have 21 individually every summer. And so it's a time to talk one-on-one as people outside of a large group, or some school boards have stuff on TV or are televised, mine aren't. But I'm just saying outside of that kind of environment. So I learned that decision to do that has been one of the best decisions I've ever made, is getting to know people for who they are. Why are they connected to this work? Why did they run for the school board? What are their hopes and dreams when their tenure is up? And that is best done in a setting that they choose. I've been car riding, I've gone mall walking, I've been on the beach with them. Wherever they want to meet, I'll go. And so that I learned like that decision is great. And I continue to do that. I'm going to be starting year 9 and I've always done it. I also do stuff in smaller groups, and that has been helpful to be able to meet with smaller groups. What I'm learning now is also equity work. Everyone has their own emotional response to it, as I've said. And I don't always know why something might be a trigger for someone. And I know that the vast majority of people are extremely supportive. And I sometimes have learned now that I may have over allocated time to try to make it perfect with everyone, because I know the importance of relationships. But I also have to be remembering that 85% of the vote is still really good. And I gotta take care of the collective whole and not have the collective whole feel as though their needs aren't being met.
Yes, this is why I'm glad you're here today. This is your intervention on imperfect leadership. Okay with excellence. You don't have to have perfection.
Yeah. And letting go, and the chips will fall how they fall. And hopefully over time, people will recognize the work and the excellent work, which I think people do, the quality of the work, the people doing the work, and that over time will onboard more and more people.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, as you've noted, to consider the mental models that people bring to the work. So understanding to some degree their beliefs and their principles and their values, because it absolutely informs how they structure their own systems of understanding, or even if they're in a power position, the systems they want to create, and then how they react over time, the sort of patterns of behavior. And then what we see in terms of their actions, their votes if it's a board member, or their actions as an administrator, or as a teacher who decides that they're going to respond to a behavior in a certain way. It all goes back down to those mental models. And so this work around equity is so incredibly important, and it's incredibly slow because we think about how we want to shift minds. And so many of us are fixed in those mental models of how we see the world and how we've been taught to see it. And so it does take time. And yet you're in a position where you're trying to dismantle a sort of era's generational historical inequities that have existed. I'm curious, what frustrated you as you look back on this experience? What was frustrating for you?
I think every day when you're in a situation where someone that you think or perceive should really be in the same place as you on an issue, and they might not be, that is frustrating. And you got to figure out, okay, that didn't work, so how am I going to take another run at it, kind of thing. So those happen every day. And that can be exhausting. I think also, I was in a conversation this morning, managing the adult's emotional response to the work is really exhausting. And it's the job. So it's a major part of the job. So I'm not skirting that. I'm just saying that's a lot. And so what I have to be better at building in my own self-care plan, and whatever that looks like, because when you're an N of one, and I'm also not a typical superintendent. So even the typical superintendents have each other, but I don't necessarily have that group either, because my role isn't the same as theirs. And what I say to one still might be said to someone else that I didn't necessarily intend it for. So I have to be very careful, even in the superintendent world, who talk about safety and being there for each other, sometimes might not be the safe group for me either in my work.
I was so startled by how competitive sometimes this field is, when there is only one of us in each of these roles. And that our default, our bias should be towards support, when we have to learn, I actually have to approach this carefully before I recognize, no, this is a supportive, trusting relationship.
Yeah. So that probably has been where some of my most disappointment has been, because you think you have a small cohort, and in many circles, that's true. Just the uniqueness of this position that Illinois has is, I really do feel like I'm an N of one. And so I have to really look for other sources of support in other ways to completely remove me from any potential political difficulty. And so that can be frustrating or disappointing, because I don't have the same resources that somebody else might have.
Yeah. Let's wrap this up on a positive, because you're in your second strategic plan now. So that speaks to the successes you've had, and now you've built the second one together with your community of learners. parents, school districts. So in the end, what was something that was good that came out of this situation?
I would say what I'm probably most proud of is we've made programmatic, meaning student learning decisions, allowing students from the minute they enter a school system to be completely included like everyone else, no matter their needs. And they will never know that if we hadn't intervened, they would have had a completely different educational experience. We talk internally about that. Like that I'm most proud of, because the user, meaning the student and the family, will not know that we intervened and created a system of inclusivity from the minute they set foot in the school system. And so that's not an ACT test score. That's not a MAP score. That is just the ultimate feeling of empowerment that I think we're probably most proud of as TrueNorth.
I will tell you, Kurt, I think that is absolutely your legacy and absolutely a model for the nation. I want to thank you so much. My guest today was Dr. Kurt Schneider, Superintendent of TrueNorth Educational Cooperative 804 in Highland Park, Illinois. And I will say one thing first. When you talked about going and taking walks on the beach, people should recognize that you live by Lake Michigan. You're not going on these like fancy trips to go walk with people on beaches. You're walking pretty close to home. But I do want to seriously thank you so much for reminding us about the importance of a shared image, reminding us about these episodic changes don't make system changes. So the difference between change as opposed to just initiative, thinking about engaging the people most impacted by a decision, fighting all learners, and really understanding and really flipping in our minds that, you know what, self-contained really does box kids in, and it boxes their futures as well. Thank you so much for everything that you do. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's an honor to be asked. I'm thrilled to have done it. Thank you.
So we are back, and I don't know about you, but anytime I listen to this conversation, I'm choked up by a number of things. One, just how inspiring the work is in his district. TrueNorth sounds like he's lucky to be there, and they are lucky to have him. I think there's a really nice relationship there.
His clarity of what he came there to do and what he is working to change. It's that part, that's the true north for him, right? The thing that he's following, that he's going towards, makes it easier for him to step into his fears. Makes it easier for him to go, well, I know it has changed, and I know all these things is going to, all these sort of unknowns are going to make me scared and nervous and all that stuff. But I know what I'm doing. I know what I want to achieve. My intent is clear. I wrote that down as a note that I thought was really fascinating. I think the over and over this concept of fear preventing us, that our intent and action don't match. That's usually the issue, like an N of 1, which goes to the superintendent perspective that you bring that I don't bring. Like I've never been a superintendent, but I can say the fear part, if your intent is clear and you do everything you can to match your actions to your intent, you'll get to where you want to go. It's the fear part that prevents us from putting our actions to our intent. Well, I think you're bringing up some interesting pieces, and the superintendency is a political position, sadly. So you are the CEO and you're the risk manager of the district. And in some cases, so in my case, $300+ million budget, 300 square miles, and 19,000 kids and children with unique needs. And we were a district that, because of how we were spaced out by geographic layout of the district, that we created programs in buildings throughout the district, provided busing and all those types of things. In theory, it made a lot of sense for children with a disability, autism may be an example, that there would be an excellent team of teachers at that school. And the school principal would absolutely make sure that everybody in the program, even if they didn't live in the neighborhood, were part of that school community. And there would be times where a parent would say, that's all fine and good. Love that principal. Love that school. Takes me 30 minutes to get to that school. And I have a school that's just down the street and I want my child to go there. And that's where we would have issues, because the feedback from teams and probably my own mindset at the time, I would say talking to Kurt was transformational for me and my own mindset. Absolutely, it was. That's why I really was looking forward to hearing your perspective of our conversation with him, because I could sit back on compliance. Were we compliant? Yes.
Were we holding IEP meetings? Were we monitoring progress? Were we giving constant feedback to parents? Were we loving on kids? Absolutely. Were we measuring their goals? You bet. And there's a difference between compliance and vision. Because vision would say, okay, this parent wants their child to be a part of the school community. How do we make that work? What are the ways we can do that without saying, what are all the reasons why we can't do that? And so, yeah, talking to Kurt was truly transformational because, like, on my website, it would say, I have 3 clever kids who are constantly trying to outwit their parents. And I had a parent who threw that back in my face and said, I wouldn't expect you to get this because you got 3 clever kids who are trying to outwit you at and all I want is my kid to sit in a class. I'm not expecting my child to understand the science lab. In this case, it was secondary. It wasn't elementary. And so this is where it gets even more difficult. Child has a potential life expectancy that is going to be significantly shorter than their peers. Yeah. And the parent says, you're having the child be part of this life skills class. I can't tell you that my child's going to reach that age where they're supposed to have these life skills to be able to work in a hospital or something like that. I just want them to be in the science lab and potentially experience the unexpected combination of 2 elements that their peers have just combined and may not be able to show that they're understanding. I just want that for my child. And I regret to this day being in the position to say, I know you have appealed to everyone and has now come to me because they don't come to the superintendent immediately in a large district. So this was appeal after appeal. And I still said no. Oh man, Jamie. That makes me think of a question that I wrote down for you, Peter, as I listened to your processing with Kurt in real time. And you said, quote, the system will work aggressively to work its way back to status quo. It likes status quo. It's comfortable there. What's the system? Because we use that phrase, oh, the system wants to go back to status quo. I agree. And I'm interested in your perspective, especially given that story you just shared. So the system is 4 parts. At the top is all the actions and things and events that you can see. So that's how people see the system. Now I'm going to go down to the bottom all the way to number 4. Its base are those mental models, the beliefs, the principles, and the values that anyone brings that the organization has set as its values, beliefs, and principles. And built upon that are the structures that have been, so policies and rules and handbooks. Those rules and policies and guidelines are built on those beliefs, principles, and values. And then above that are these patterns of behavior. So what you can expect to see over time and based on, again, those policies and based on those mindsets. And then what is a direct connection to all of those things, the events and the actions. That's the system. And so when you try to agitate for change, let's approach this problem in a new way. Let's shift our sense of how we approach social emotional learning and really speak to the intentional actions that we're going to take so that adults and children in this building or in this school district feel as if they belong. That may mean that we have to reevaluate some of our policies around, let's say, children from underrepresented groups being in honors and AP classes. You have just tried to agitate for significant change, in which case, when you have not dealt with the mindset, now you have potentially an adult who says, look, I told you the child wasn't able to take this class because I didn't shift the way I behaved in terms of making sure the child has support, making sure the child understands, making sure that I continue to tell the child, I'm glad you're here. Making sure the child knows that, yes, there's a graphing calculator. Sure, it's expensive, but I'm not going to tell them it's expensive and send this message that they don't belong. So I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that they belong. So that's what I mean by the system will agitate. When we agitate for change, the system will aggressively work back to status quo. Woof, we tried that. It didn't work. That child didn't belong in this class. That was such a fun answer. You clearly have thought about this. I love the way you outlined it. And the last thought that really resonated with me
that we've used a ton of times in our models for change. When you guys talked about Senge, and you talked a little bit about focusing on the 85%. So be good with excellence. You're never going to get to perfection. There's no such thing. Tends that most folks don't focus on the 85%. Let's say you have 30% that are all with you. Then you have another 30% that's questioning, nervous, but would be with you if you listen to them and you talk to them and ask good questions, and they get to ask good questions. Now you're at 60%. Then you have the 20% that is pretty much a naysayer, but that they are unlikely to stay naysayer if 60% say, yes, let's do this. Then you have the last 20%, which are just straight up, hell no, never, ever. We spend so much time worrying on the never, ever that we forget to be open to the people who just want to ask questions. They just want to know. And we start negotiating with them to try to get them to some common ground, to some area where they're willing to maybe not completely and absolutely undermine the work. And then those who you had with you are going, wait a second, are we really doing this or we're not doing it? Right, exactly. Now all of a sudden the people who are in it on the first place, you said, well, wait, isn't that a key point? That idea, aren't we supposed to keep that? Why are we turning that point away or not doing that? I think that when we get to the 80%, you got enough. And I also don't want to diminish the never, ever, evers. I don't want to link. Sometimes I think this concept of this dichotomy of good and bad people comes up, and I'm like, it's not, that person's great. Yes, the person. This is what I would say. It's just not this. I think sometimes that 20%, many of them are veterans, and they've been around, and they need to wait and see that we are serious, and that I don't think all of them are never, ever. They're going, never, ever. You know why? Because I've been in this building for 30 years. And every time somebody comes in, they've got this grand plan about they're going to make life easier for kids, make life easier for teachers, make life easier for support staff. I've been here 30 years. It hasn't happened. So never, ever, my man, until I start to see that you mean it. You are so right. Because then this takes me full circle, or somewhat full circle, to that point about the adult's emotional response to the work is really exhausting. And here's my theory. As someone who I have taught every single grade level. My first job, I also think this is really fascinating to me now, and as a parent of someone with special needs, my first job was a special ed teacher at a K-5 special day class. I had 12 total kids, all of them extremely unique needs, and me wholly unqualified to teach that class. Wholly unqualified. And then after that, I taught high school. I also taught middle school, all the grade levels, every single grade level. I actually think the teaching job is so hard because no one shares with teachers or says to teachers, the primary job is supporting the emotional response to the work. And that is with kids first, all day with kids. So that my emotional bandwidth, my own emotional intelligence is constantly being used so that come Wednesday, I'm out of gas. And then I've been asked by the principal, hey, what do you think of running a Latinos Unidos club or something like that? I'm like, hell no. It's going to take every ounce of energy for me just to get home. We give teachers no credit for the emotional work that goes with educating kids. The bulk of our job, because of the system, is defined as academic learning, cognitive development, when the bulk of the work is actually emotional support. One of the biggest challenges of a leader, and this is what we say all the time, our organization, emotional intelligence is the most important quality of a leader. It's number one to me. And that's the perfect place to stop. Thanks, Jamie. See you next week. Yep, we'll see you next week. I really enjoyed that, as usual. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
I'm Jamie Almanzan.
And this has been another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor.
It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be Imperfect Leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast.
At the end of every interview that we have for teacher candidates, we will say, "What questions do you have for us?" And they will always ask, "Well, what kind of support can I expect?" And we will always say, "Well, don't worry, we'll give you a mentor." But it's not real mentorship. I mean, it's support with the difficult kid or the field trip form or the grade card, but it isn't coaching. That's where partners like EdConnective step in. They provide observation and feedback with practice. That's real coaching. Their mission is to ensure that every student thrives by facilitating exceptional educator growth. So whether it's science of reading, whether it's leadership development, whether you're trying to build the best recruitment and retention efforts, check out edconnective.com.